Okay, welcome everyone to this Marian Day, and today we're blessed to have a very distinguished guest and speaker, Roy, actually I'm not even sure how to pronounce your, Schoeman. Roy Schoeman is with us today, and Roy grew up in New York City in a conservative Jewish family and studied under the prominent rabbis of the time. And very gifted intellectually. He went on to study at MIT and also at Harvard, and then after the studies, went on to teach at Harvard. So at a certain point, there was a divine intervention and Marian intervention in his life, and he had a conversion to Christianity, to the Catholic faith, and he's gone on to speak at conferences like this and also on EWTN, and he's written a couple of books that are available in the vestibule. So during the breaks, you're welcome to go and get your books and have Roy sign them. And so we're very pleased to have Roy with us today, and welcome to Roy.
Hi, thanks for coming, and I'm very happy to be here. I've felt very close to the Franciscans of the Immaculate for a long time. In fact, I owe my vocation, if I can say so, to Brother Francis Mary, who was a Franciscan of the Immaculate, who got me in the book writing business. But anyway, I just want to start at the beginning with my witness testimony. And I have the great luxury of speaking twice today. So between the two talks, what I want to do is give my witness testimony and also talk about the role of Judaism in salvation history and the way that Judaism and the Catholic Church are actually not two separate religions. They're two state. I'll just start with here. I will get to my witness testimony pretty soon. It seems totally evident to me, and the only logical, really, viewpoint is that that Judaism and the Catholic Church are essentially two phases of the same religion. They're two phases of the same plan for salvation that was basically stretches from the Garden of Eden until the Second Coming. When God originally created man, he created him to live in a state of uninterrupted intimacy with God, bliss, no work, no suffering, no death, and so forth, right? We know that in the Garden of Eden. When man chose to sin, that original relationship between God and man was shattered, but God knew at that very moment that at some point in the future, he would not only restore man to that original exalted state, but raise him infinitely higher by the incarnation of the second person of the Most Holy Trinity as a man at a future point in time. If the second person of the Most Holy Trinity was going to incarnate as a man, it would be at a particular point in time, in a particular place in the world, among a particular people, in the womb of a particular virgin, and of course, that people would have to be prepared. They would have to be separated out from all of the people wandering the earth in those days, kept separate for almost 2,000 years, while they received a tremendous amount of divine revelation. First, to know about the one true uncreated creator God, to know about the creation of man, to know about the fall of man, the seriousness of sin, the need for redemption, the future coming of a Redeemer. They would have to be given enough divine revelation to identify the Redeemer when he came, and would have to be given enough understanding of theology, essentially, to make sense of what was happening and to spread the new religion to the four corners of the earth after it happened. That's what the Jews were, right? They were just picked out of all of the people on the earth. You could say at random, or I could talk about why God chose the Jews. There's an old ditty, how odd of God to choose the Jews. But in any case, they were chosen for this most important single role ever given to any people, to basically enable the incarnation of God as man and to enable salvation to flow to all of mankind through Christianity, through in particular the Catholic Church and the sacraments. The intention always being that when the incarnation and life and passion and death of Jesus took place, that original special relationship between God and the Jews would be extended in a far amplified form to all of humanity through Christianity and through the Catholic Church and the sacraments. So they're not two separate religions, they're two phases of the same plan for salvation. That makes sense? So anyway, that is, by the way, I don't want to start with salesmanship, but that's what my first book was about. Salvation is from the Jews, the role of Judaism in salvation history from Abraham to the Second Coming. It's really from Adam and Eve to the Second Coming, but I didn't want to sound pretentious. Anyway, so where was I? I don't even know where I was, but anyway, so my witness testimony. So anyway, I don't even consider myself a convert, by the way, because a convert implies that they change from one religion to another. I just went from a Jew who was not a follower of the Jewish Messiah, because all of Judaism was about the Messiah to come, who was Jesus, right? So I just went from being a Jew who kind of missed the boat when the Messiah came to a Jew who followed the Messiah through the transition to the fulfilled stage of Judaism, which was the Catholic Church. So that actually should make me more of a Jew rather than less of a Jew, more of a Jew than ever. I consider myself more of a Jew than ever after having entered the Catholic Church. And that is exactly the viewpoint of every other Jew that I have ever met or read about who became Christian or, better yet, Catholic. They don't consider themselves as converts. They consider themselves as completed Jews, fulfilled Jews, and so forth. Okay, take a breath, start with my witness testimony. That's what they promised you. Okay, so I was born and raised, actually it was outside of New York City, in a suburb of New York City. My parents were both German Jewish Holocaust refugees. They both were born and raised in Germany. My father left shortly after Hitler came to power, when Jews were still allowed to leave, as long as they didn't take anything with them. My mother was less fortunate. Her family fled to France, to Paris, but that didn't last for long. Paris, of course, fell very quickly under the Nazis, and my mother was actually arrested and put on a train to go back to Germany to a concentration camp, but she escaped while the train was still in France and eventually made it to the United States, where my parents met and married. Growing up, I mean, I was entirely Jewish. My family was entirely Jewish, needless to say. The communities were more separated in those days. The town where my parents bought a house was actually the only town in the area that allowed Jews to buy houses. So, of course, all of our friends were Jewish. All of my parents' friends were Jewish. All of my friends were Jewish. I went to Jewish religious education from the beginning of my school years until university, alongside the normal secular education. In my senior year of high school, I became even more devoutly Jewish, religious, and I spent the summer between high school and college living and traveling in Israel in the as a kind of disciple of a Hasidic rabbi. You know, the Hasids with the ear curls and the long black coats and the beards that look a little like Franciscans, but anyway. Anyway, so I considered not coming back to the United States to begin university, but entering the closest thing that Judaism has to religious life, which is a life of prayer and study in a yeshiva in Jerusalem. But I didn't. I returned to the United States. I began MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and I lost my faith there under two influences, my Jewish faith, of course. First of all, under the pseudo-scientific worldview that religion is basically just a superstition that man came up with to give him answers until he had science to give him the true answers of everything. Now, I call it a pseudo-scientific worldview. That's what it is. It's the opposite of a scientific view, because the essence of science is you have to look at the data, look at the evidence, and form a theory that can explain the evidence. And if it's successful in explaining the evidence, you can keep that theory. And if it fails to explain the evidence, you have to discard it, throw it away, and come up with a theory that does explain the evidence. Now, in fact, materialism, the idea that there's no God, no spirituality, that everything is just the physical world that you see, totally fails to explain the evidence. Not only the more fundamental evidence having to do with life and so forth, but I think that in our day, God has, because of our slight scientific orientation, given us the special favor of a lot of physically, materialistically documented evidence supporting the truths of the Catholic faith, right? We have the Shroud of Turin, which all know about that, the image of Jesus on the burial cloth, that even today could not be counterfeited, literally, by all of the science of today. No one could succeed in imitating successfully the Shroud of Turin. The Tilma of Guadalupe, similarly, the miracle of the sun at Fatima, where the sun spun and seemed to crash to the earth and was seen by 80 to 100,000 people, including skeptics and communists and cynics and atheists, and on and on and on. We have the Eucharistic miracles, the medieval ones like Lanciano, but there was a very similar Eucharistic miracle. I think it was in 1999 in Buenos Aires, and then another one in France somewhere in 2004. The same thing, where the consecrated host turned into human flesh and blood. We're talking about 1999 and 2004. They were totally examined by forensic pathologists, by all of science, and it was actually human blood, human heart muscle tissue. The tissue actually revealed the fact that the person died under great suffering, and so forth. I didn't prepare that, so I don't have the details. But anyway, it's just another example that it's like totally unscientific to say that we're superstitious peasants believing a bunch of myths. I mean, you can't nail down these people and say, oh yeah, how do you explain this? How do you explain this? How do you explain this? But they're totally unable to, in fact, if you could nail them down to. As a matter of fact, what they say, and now I'll go back to my witness, or start my witness testimony. But anyway, what they say is essentially, well, we know the medical healings at Lourdes. That's another example. There was a very famous journalist at the turn of the century, Émile Zola, who went down to Lourdes to disprove the Catholic faith, to show that the medical miracles were just like, hypochondriacs, who had, psychological illnesses or whatever, and they thought they were healed. But in any case, he saw a number of very dramatic cases, including a woman whose face was eaten away by cancerous growths, who was completely restored when she went into the baths instantaneously. And his response was, I don't care how many miracles I'll see, I don't care how many of these healings I'll see, I still won't believe. And that's basically the counter-Catholic attitude is, first of all, I'm not going to allow myself to expose myself to the evidence. And if I do, I don't care how much evidence I'm exposed to. I just choose not to believe. So anyway, that's not scientific. It's the opposite. As a matter of fact, G.K. Chesterton has a wonderful quote that those who believe in miracles, right or wrong, believe in them on the basis of the evidence. Those who do not believe in miracles, right or wrong, refuse to believe in them on the basis of faith. Right? It's exactly opposite what MIT would have had me to believe, so to speak. But back to my witness testimony. At the time, I didn't realize this, and I bought that party line. I came out of MIT, agnostic or atheist. I went on to Harvard Business School. I did well enough there that upon graduation, they invited me back to join the faculty. I found myself as a newly minted professor of marketing at Harvard Business School at the ripe old age of 29. And that's really where my witness testimony begins, because what was happening was the following. Was all my life since I was a small child, I felt there has to be a real meaning and purpose to life, which I thought when I was older I would come into the real meaning and purpose of life, which I thought would come from entering into a personal relationship with God. As a child, I really expected that to happen at my bar mitzvah. The bar mitzvah is parallel to the Catholic confirmation. When the child is about 13, there's a ceremony in the synagogue where he enters into religious adulthood. And I really thought that would be the moment when I would enter into a personal relationship with God. When that didn't happen, it was actually one of the saddest days of my childhood. But then pretty soon I decided the real meaning and purpose of life would come when I got a driver's license, or when I got a girlfriend, or when I began university, or if I got into Harvard Business School, or when I began my career and so forth. But here I was already more successful in a worldly career than I ever expected to be, being a professor at Harvard Business School, but there was still no meaning or purpose to life. You know, I thought that we're just like a chemical accident. 5 billion years ago, a bolt of lightning hit a puddle of amino acids and we eventually crawled out. There's no meaning or purpose to anything. We live for 80 or 90 years and we die and that's it. Things happen, there's no pattern to it. Actually, one of the things that bothered me the most was I couldn't figure out any reason to be good, actually. I couldn't figure out any basis to respect morality if everything's just an accident. So anyway, I fell into the darkest despair of my life at that point, because at this point there was nothing more I could imagine might give this meaningless life meaning. And so it was in that darkness, despair, that I was walking in nature early one morning. It was in the low pine woods behind the sand dunes on Cape Cod, just lost in my thoughts, when I received the most spectacular grace of my life. I was just walking along, and from one moment to the next, the curtain between earth and heaven disappeared, and I found myself in the presence of God, very knowingly in the presence of God, seeing my life as I would see it after I died, looking back over my life in the presence of God. And I understood everything as I would understand it after I died, looking back over my life in the presence of God. I saw that after I died, my two greatest regrets would be, number one, all of the time and energy I had wasted worrying about not being loved, when every moment of my existence I was held in an ocean of love greater than I ever imagined could exist, coming from this all-knowing, all-loving God. And the other great regret would be all of the time and energy I had worried about not being loved, when every moment of my existence I was held in an ocean of love greater than I could ever imagine, coming from this God. I saw that absolutely everything that had ever happened to me had been the most perfect thing that could have been arranged, coming from the hands of this all-knowing, all-loving God, not only including those things that had caused the most suffering at the time, that I had thought of as the greatest disasters at the time, but especially those things that had caused the most suffering at the time. I saw that it was all true, that we live forever, that every action has a moral content that is observed and recorded for all eternity, that every time we take advantage of an opportunity to do something of value in the eyes of heaven, we will very literally be rewarded for that for all eternity. And every opportunity we let slip and don't take advantage of will be a lost opportunity for all eternity. I saw that the meaning and purpose of my life was to worship and serve my Lord and Master and God, who was revealing himself to me. The most profoundly affecting part of this revelation was to come into the absolute and full knowledge and understanding that God himself, the God who had not only created everything that exists, but actually created existence itself out of non-existence, not only knew me by name, not only loved me, not only was controlling everything that ever happened to me, but cared about how I felt at every moment, as though I were the only creature he had ever created, as though he had his ear held up to my lips to hear the faintest murmuring of how I felt, and as though in a very real way, he knew how I felt at every moment and cared about how I felt at every moment, such that everything that made me sad made him sad, and everything that made me happy made him happy. And it was coming into that knowledge which was by far the most transformative part of this experience. Now, I saw all of this kind of instantaneously. Needless to say, it was really neat. It was as though I had a searchlight on my forehead, and wherever I looked, in other words, whatever question I asked myself, I was shown the answer. It was like an intellectual vision. I could still see the physical world, by the way. I was actually still walking during this. I could see the physical world, but I could also see the spiritual world. And it was as though the physical world was a painted, very thin, gossamer veil over the spiritual world, in front of the spiritual world. And I wasn't surprised that I could see the spiritual world. The only thing that surprised me during this experience was that I could ever have not seen it, because it was so much more real and more concrete and more substantial than the physical world that I just couldn't understand how I could ever have been blind to it. And I could not imagine, I literally could not imagine ever again being unable to see it. It was just so much more real and more present than the physical world. Anyway, I saw all of this stuff, I understood all of this stuff, but that wasn't an instantaneous moral transformation, needless to say. All my life I had been totally selfish. I don't know about totally selfish, but very selfish. And I didn't understand there was anything wrong with it. I thought that, you were supposed to do the best for yourself that you could. So during this experience, because during this experience, I understood how foolish I had been to have been. I didn't understand how foolish I had been to be selfish all my life. That took until later. But I understood how foolish I had been to be stupidly selfish all my life, because I was putting all my time and energy into accumulating things that wouldn't do me any good at all, even 80 years later after I was dead. And if I wanted to be smart and selfish, the only thing that made sense would be to try to accumulate as much treasure in heaven as possible, essentially. And so if I want to be smart and selfish, the only thing that made sense would be to try to be as much of a saint as possible. I didn't understand that the selfishness was the problem, but I understood that the image I had was as though you had a child that was playing Monopoly and trying to greedily accumulate all of the brightly colored Monopoly money, that was me, when there was a pile of solid gold coins next to it that he was ignoring. So that's how I saw all this stuff in this experience. Now, I obviously understood that the meaning and purpose of my life was to worship and serve my Lord and God and Master, who was revealing himself to me. But what I didn't know was what his name was and what religion this was. I couldn't think of this as Judaism and him as the God of the Old Testament. Now I know that it was the same God. But when one reads the Old Testament, the picture of God that emerges is of a God far more distant and judgmental and severe than this God was. The picture I had of God was the picture that you get, like in the book of Exodus, when the Jews are in the desert before God calls Moses up to the top of Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments. God tells Moses to build a fence around the base of the mountain to prevent any of the people from approaching the base of the mountain while I'm on top, because if they even touch the base of the mountain while I'm on top, they have to be instantly killed for the sacrilege. So that was, kind of my picture of God, whereas this God, as I said, was, more intimate, more present and intimately connected with me than I could ever imagine, and more caring and doting over me than, a grandfather over his, one and only grandchild. So I want to know who this God was, of course. I want to know what religion to follow. So I prayed as I was walking. As I said, I was still walking. I prayed, let me know your name so I know what religion to follow, to worship and serve you properly. I don't mind if you're Buddha and I have to become a Buddhist. I don't mind if you're Krishna and I have to become a Hindu. I don't mind if you're Apollo and I have to become a Roman pagan, as long as you're not Christ and I have to become Christian. And I very literally prayed that. Somebody here asked me where that came from. I'm not going to, I'll give a short answer now, which is, first of all, if there are any Jews here, they certainly understand where that came from. But anyway, all my life growing up, I had thought of Christianity as the enemy, that basically Jesus was a false Messiah who started this false offshoot of Judaism called Christianity, which resulted in the last 2,000 years of persecution of the Jews, essentially. So it was like going over into the enemy camp, and that Jesus was the worst thing to ever happen to Judaism and the Jews. So that's a very short version of the answer. So anyway, he didn't reveal his name to me at the time. I obviously wasn't ready to hear it. But I went back home probably happier than I had ever been in my life, certainly happier than I had ever been since childhood. I knew it was all true. I knew we lived forever. I knew there was never any reason to worry about anything, that absolutely everything that happened was the most perfect thing that could be arranged. No reason for any anxiety ever. I knew that the happiest day of our life would be the day that we die, if we play our cards right, and that's really true. That's really true. I can't quote St. Paul off the top of my head, but we are totally incapable of comprehending what the joy will be as soon as we die and for all eternity. And I'll actually get to that a little more if I get further in my witness testimony before I have to stop. Anyway, I will. So anyway, I was walking on cloud nine. All I wanted to do was, spread the good news, and also start accumulating, building my bank account in heaven. I got to admit, I had that selfish motivation also. So anyway, I go back to Cambridge, where I was living, and in this academic career, and I instantly had lost all interest in teaching Harvard MBAs how to make a little more money, and all I wanted to do was, as I said, build up my bank account in heaven and honor and worship and serve this God who had introduced himself to me, and if possible, repeat the experience and so forth. And so I had just had this mystical experience, and I wanted to find out more about it. I had never heard of mystical experiences, actually. And you have a mystical experience, you want to find out more about it. What do? You go find a mystic to talk to, which wasn't a very prudent thing to do in a university town in the 1980s. And so I found this mystic to talk to, who was actually a fallen away Catholic, a would-be Kabbalist, and so forth. And I made an appointment to go see him, hoping that he could shed some light on what this was all about and teach me about what was going on and so forth. Well, he was basically into this New Age stuff and Kabbalah, and he put me on some wrong paths, kind of this New Age kind of Hindu-type meditation, and I wasted some time for a number of months, looking into that stuff. But one very good thing happened when I was visiting him that evening, which was he had on his coffee table book something like, it was called The 100 Greatest Miracles of Modern Times. It was this, coffee table-like picture book of miracles in our times. And when he went in the kitchen to prepare us some tea at one point, I kind of just casually leafed through the book, and my eyes fell on a page dedicated to the miracle of Fatima. I never heard of the miracle of Fatima. I counted it up. I had been in school 25 years of my life at this point, and nobody had ever told me about Fatima. So I read this one-page description of the miracle of Fatima, and he comes back from the kitchen with the tea, and I point to the page, and I say, "Is this really true? Did this really happen?" And he says, "Oh, yes." And then my next question to him is, "Has anyone else ever heard of it?" And his response is, "Oh, yeah, all Catholics know about it." And then I ask him, "Has anything else ever been written about it?" And he says, "Oh, yeah, just go to the public library. You'll find a foot of bookshelf space of books on the miracle of Fatima." Well, my immediate reaction was to be filled with furious indignation. How could they have kept this secret from me? How could they have not told me about this? I felt that my whole life had been different if I knew that miracles still happened. Throughout whatever it was 13 years of religious education growing up, my constant question to the teachers was, why did God used to perform miracles in the days of the Old Testament and no longer does so? And they never had an answer. I felt, and I was right, feeling that my life would have been totally different if I knew that miracles still happened. I'm getting back to my earlier digression, but it's really important. It's really a very powerful means of evangelization, And even if people don't believe you, it's really important to plant that seed in their mind, that there are these miracles, the miracles that involve the Blessed Virgin Mary, miracles that involve the Eucharist, and so forth, and that they're happening, and that there's scientific documentation of it, and that thousands and thousands and thousands of otherwise credible people attest to them and are eyewitnesses of it. So anyway, I leave his apartment that night with my arms full of these horrible New Age books, but with the seed planted of the miracle of Fatima. And anyway, and I waste about a year, almost a year, on this stupid New Age stuff. But there was one smart thing I did during that year, which was every night before going to sleep, I would say a short prayer I had made up to know the name of my Lord and God and Master who had revealed himself to me in that first experience. And a year to the day after that first experience, and I know it was a year to the day because I remember praying a prayer of thanksgiving before going to sleep for what had happened exactly a year earlier. I went to sleep, and I thought I was woken gently by a hand on my shoulder and led to a room and left alone with the most beautiful young woman I could ever imagine. And I knew without being told that it was the Blessed Virgin Mary. And when I found myself in her presence, all I wanted to do was throw myself on my knees and honor her appropriately. In fact, the first thought that crossed my mind was, oh my goodness, I wish I at least knew the Hail Mary, but I didn't. Now, the first thing she said to me was she offered to answer any questions I might want to ask her. Before I go into that, let me say a couple of things about finding myself in her presence. First of all, let me back up and say I now understand that if there had been a video camera in the room, it would have shown my body asleep in bed throughout this experience. At the time, I thought I was completely awake. I thought I was completely awake. My memory represents it as though I were completely awake. I remember thinking about different questions. Should I ask that? No, that's silly, I'll ask that. I have a word-for-word memory of it as though I were completely awake, but I now understand that it was some kind of, out-of-body kind of a thing. So I want to, clear that up. But I also, two things about finding myself in her presence. First of all, as perfectly beautiful as she was to look at, even more profoundly affecting was the beauty of her voice, the sound of her voice. And the only way I can describe it is her voice was made up of that which makes music music. And when she spoke, this incredibly beautiful voice just flowed through me, carrying with it her love and lifting me up into a state of ecstasy, a continual ecstasy greater than I ever imagined could exist. And I am convinced that that ecstasy was a taste of heaven, and that the love that flowed through her and flows through her now is actually, I don't know whether to say, an echo of the bliss of heaven. Anyway, so back to this experience. So, as I said, the first thing she said was she offered to answer any questions I might want to ask her. The first question that I kind of wanted to ask her was to teach me the Hail Mary so I could honor her appropriately. But I was too proud to admit that I didn't know it. So as a kind of indirect way of getting her to teach me the Hail Mary, I asked her what her favorite prayer to her was. Well, her initial answer was a little bit coy. It was, I love all prayers to me. But I was a little bit pushy, so I said, but you must love some prayers to you more than others. And so she relented, and she recited a prayer to Mary. But it was in Portuguese, and I didn't know any Portuguese. So all I could do was make the effort to remember the first few syllables phonetically. And the next morning when I woke up, I immediately wrote them down phonetically. And then much later, when I met a Portuguese Catholic woman, I asked her to recite the prayers to Mary in Portuguese so that I could identify the prayer. And to the best of my ability, I identified it as, O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee. Most of the questions I asked her came out of just being overwhelmed by who she was and being overwhelmed by her presence. So at one point, I kind of stammered out more of an exclamation than a question. I kind of stammered out, how can it be? How is it possible? How can it be that you're so exalted, that you're so magnificent, that you're so glorious? How can it be? And her response was to look down at me almost pityingly and shake her head gently and say, "Oh no, you don't understand. You don't understand anything. I'm nothing. I'm a creature. I'm a created thing. He's everything." And then, again, out of the desire to honor her somehow appropriately, I asked her what title she liked best for herself. And her reply was, "I am the beloved daughter of the Father, mother of the Son, and spouse of the Spirit." Well, of course, I knew I was never stupid. I knew that if this is the Blessed Virgin Mary, it had been Christ in the earlier experience, and this was all about Christianity, and I had better get up to speed pretty quick. And all my life, I had heard the expression, the Holy Spirit, but I had no idea what it meant. I had no idea that he was a person. I had never literally probably touched a New Testament, much less opened it, for fear of the contamination which would come from touching a New Testament. Not uncommon among Jews, even today. So anyway, I knew if this is Christianity, and I had always heard the expression the Holy Spirit, I had better, get up to speed pretty quick. But I apologize for the way I phrased the question, but I didn't know any better. I asked her, "What's this business about the Holy Spirit?" And her response was just to look upwards with an expression melting with love and say, "He's his gaze." So I asked her a couple more questions. It went downhill from there. The other questions were either personal or silly. And then she said she had something she wanted to speak to me about, so she spoke to me for about another 10 to 15 minutes. And then the audience was over, and I went back to sleep. The next morning when I woke up, I knew that it had been Christ in the earlier experience. I knew that I wanted nothing other than to be as fully and completely a Christian as possible. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what the difference was between a Protestant and a Catholic. And there wasn't much I could do other than open the local phone book and find a local church to go to, which is Protestant. I'll go into, in a few moments, what put me on the right path there. But I want to say something else about the next morning when I woke up. My first thought when I woke up, very literally, was, "Oh boy, I can't wait to go back to sleep again tonight and see her again." And then when that didn't happen, I said to myself, well, it's bound to be at least once a week, right? And then when that didn't happen, well, once a month and so forth. And by the time I realized it would never happen again, the memory had faded to the point where I could face the prospect of going through another 60 or 70 years of life without seeing her again. But if I had known the next morning when I woke up that I would have to live to the end of my life and die before I got to see her again, I don't know how I could have gone on, because all of this life was so colorless and tasteless and gray and cardboard compared to being in her presence that it would have been extremely hard to face it. And I feel sorry. Again, I don't like to get into controversial areas, but I feel sorry for the Medjugorje visionaries. I know that they have suffered that it's very hard to reconcile oneself to this world when the alternative is being in the presence of the Blessed Virgin Mary's love. So I knew this was Christianity. I started going to this Protestant church. But as soon as I got to know the pastor a little bit, I kind of shyly asked him, "What about the Blessed Virgin Mary?" And when he answered without the respect that I knew that she deserved, I knew this was no place for me. And the other thing that was happening was that I was spending all my free time at Marian shrines. In particular, there was a shrine to Our Lady of La Salette, not far from where I lived, in Ipswich, Massachusetts, the shrine was. And I would go up there 3 or 4 times a week just to walk the grounds and feel the presence of the Blessed Virgin Mary and kind of commune with her. I didn't know what prayer was, but just mentally talk to her and feel her presence. And of course, I was a Catholic shrine, and sometimes when I was there would be a mass going on. And whenever I was in the presence of a Mass going on, I was filled with this tremendous desire to receive Holy Communion, even though I didn't know what it was. And so those are basically the two things that pulled me fairly directly into the Catholic Church, was knowing who the Blessed Virgin Mary is and wanting to receive communion daily if possible. So I will actually take a breath and I will ask or invite any questions. And I do have, right now, I do have about another 20 minutes to talk. So I like to ask questions because the Holy Spirit works through all of us, right? And sometimes the questions bring me to something that I should have talked about and didn't. And if there's time afterwards, I'll talk about that. It was a couple of years in between the experience of the Blessed Virgin Mary and finding myself into the heart of the Catholic Church. And I can talk about some other both providential and miraculous experiences that kind of bridge the gulf. But are there any questions? Yeah? Okay, so the question is, how did my family react? Well, they were fine with it for the first 3 years because I didn't tell them. I was scared too, but I also thought it's better if they see how I've changed, that I've become a nicer person, a more loving person, a kinder person. It will set a better foundation for what I'm going to tell them. It didn't exactly work that way. When I did tell them, first of all, they did acknowledge that I had become a better person, but they became furious, especially my father, full of this kind of Jewish fatherly pride. And when he realized he couldn't talk me out of it, he went ballistic, said, he never wanted to hear my name again, he never wanted to see me again, I have no son, my son is dead, and so forth. It's not an uncommon response in Jewish families, but it was very severe. And but that only lasted less than a year, and his paternal love kind of didn't let him maintain that completely. So he reestablished contact with me on a very kind of awkward basis, and still very hostile. He was kind of okay if nothing reminded him of my conversion, but as soon as anything reminded him, he became as nasty as could be imagined. And that pretty much lasted until a long time, like 30 plus years. But it had a very happy ending, which I'll tell. God has been very faithful. So that experience of the Blessed Virgin Mary was 1987. So I told my parents in 1990, okay? In 2014, maybe 2015, my parents had gotten too old to live on their own. I lived in Naples, Florida, which has some very good assisted living facilities and, apartments, that are designed for people who are very old. So I moved my parents down there. I took care of them. I visited them. I arranged everything for them and, kind of interceded with the institution and everything, and had dinner with them probably about 4 or 5 times a week. And there were a lot of little needs that had to be met and everything. And that really softened my father's heart. He had never expected that, especially given the hostility. It melted his heart. And he actually got warm-hearted for the first time probably since I was an infant. And then he had a fall and he broke his femur, actually. He was 102 and a half at the time, so it started a downward slope. And so he was in a rehab facility while the femur was supposed to heal. It was a very painful experience. Whatever you call it, checking into that facility was horrible torture. I won't go into the details, but incredible pain he was put through. I was with him, but eventually I went home. The next morning when I went to visit him, he was sitting up in bed, glowing, and he said to me, last night, after all the commotion was over and everyone had left and the room was dark, Jesus appeared to me. Interesting, don't you think? And that's all he said. And then when I would forget to wear this, once I forgot to wear this when I visited him, he said, "Where's that thing you usually wear around your neck? You really ought to be wearing it, you know?" And he became extremely positive towards Christianity. And when this happened, in other words, when Jesus appeared to him was about 2 weeks before Easter. I baptized him on Good Friday, and he passed away on Easter Tuesday. So, all's well that ends well. My mother, similarly, I won't go into this story. That actually made my mother more hostile towards my conversion, because not only had her son joined the enemy side, but her husband had joined the enemy side, because my mother knew about this, about Jesus appearing to him and stuff. And so she became even more hostile and nasty. But again, when she was essentially on her deathbed, she was kind of on her deathbed. She was down to about 68 pounds. She was immobilized. All she could do was stare up at the ceiling 24 hours a day. So I figured it's safe. I'll tell her my witness testimony now. So I told her my witness testimony. I tried to tell her before, but it didn't go over too well. And the next morning when I visited her, she turned to me very warmly and she said, "I want to thank you. I really want to thank you for what you did yesterday." Her childhood faith had come back, and it included actually faith in Christianity. Whenever my wife would go to visit her after that and we would pray the rosary by her bedside, she would be mouthing the Hail Marys. I had my priest, I'm a member of an FSSP parish, the Tridentine Rite, the Latin Mass parish, very traditional. The priest came and confirmed my mother, invested her with the brown scapular, gave her an apostolic blessing, gave her last rites. After that, whenever I visited her, she'd be clutching the brown scapular in her fist. Whenever I brought a priest, she couldn't get enough of him. She couldn't talk at that point, but she would just gaze up on him lovingly, clasping his hand. I'm going to cry. And then when she did pass away, she was buried out of a Tridentine Rite Latin Mass with a sung Dies Irae, with the black cloths and the black candles and the incense, and then processed to the grave, from the Tridentine Requiem Mass, and buried with the full, incense and holy water and everything. But it was a Jewish cemetery because I had bought the plot earlier. I don't know what they thought about it. Yeah, well, when he was doing it, when he processed in and everything. But the gravestone was still the gravestone that I had gotten when my father passed away. It was a common gravestone. So at that point, I was still in the closet, as they say. I mean, I wasn't in the closet, but the situation with because the family was going to come and everything when my father passed away. So it's a Jewish gravestone. On Jewish tombstones, there's usually Hebrew writing, right? And nobody really can read. People think Jews can read Hebrew, but they can't really. They can maybe phonetically read it, but they're unlikely to understand it. So I had all the Old Testament verses in Hebrew that talk about Jesus, and even that use the name Jesus, one of them. So I had the passage from Job that says, I know that my Redeemer lives. I had the passage, I forget where it's from, I think it's from Isaiah, that says we will drink with joy from the fountains of salvation. And the neat thing is the word for salvation in that Hebrew is Yeshua. It's the name Jesus. And that verse has always been seen in Christianity as being about baptism. We will drink with joy from the fountains of salvation. That's the waters of baptism, from the waters of salvation. So anyway, so the gravestone looked like a Jewish gravestone, but if you could read the Hebrew, it was extremely messianic. So anyway, that's that story. I'll tell one final conversion story about how I overcame my anti-Catholicism and ended up in the Catholic Church, because there's a lot of meaning to this story. So anyway, as I said, I was spending all my free time at this shrine to Our Lady of La Salette near my house. Our Lady of La Salette was a Marian apparition that took place in 1846. It was a lot like Fatima, but it was very high in the French Alps above the tree line. about 13,000 feet, somewhere around there, 12,000 feet. It was to 2 shepherd children. It was a one-time apparition. And anyway, so what happened was, I knew about, of course, the shrine of the apparition of Our Lady of La Salette. That following winter, I was skiing in the French Alps. It rained for a couple of days straight. The skiing was pretty dull, in the rain. So I got on my rental car. I decided I would drive to the real La Salette for the afternoon and check it out. So I drove there, and I thought I'd drive there and back that afternoon, but because of the mountain roads and the blizzard that had started, it took me until the evening to get there. And so I saw there was a sign saying reception. I asked if I could stay there. That's actually, I'll mention, I asked if I could stay there because the sign said reception, but I was still Jewish, and I was actually anti-Catholic still. I mean, I was in love with the Blessed Virgin Mary, but I still had a real chip on my shoulder about the Catholic Church. So when I went up to ask if I could have a room there, I said, can one stay here? And they said, yes. And I said, but I'm Jewish. Can I anyway? And they said, of course, which really surprised me. A couple of years later, I was in Israel, and I tried to stay in a Jewish hostel, and they had a big sign, over there saying for Jews only, So, I'm not sure they had a sign, but in any case, when I asked to stay there, they said, are you Jewish? And I said, well, you tell me, let me tell you the story. And I told them the story, and they wouldn't let me stay there. That's kind of what I would expect to happen at La Salette, but it didn't happen at La Salette. So I stayed there, and then the next day when I wanted to leave, the road was closed because what had been rain in the ski area was a blizzard there, with snow at that altitude, and 3 feet of snow was falling a day. And so I was stuck there until the end of the trip. Oh gosh, I wasn't planning to tell that part of the story. Anyway, I did. So anyway, I met a French Catholic woman there. When I got back home, before I get back home, I will really stop on time, but before I got back home, I got off the mountain just in time to catch my flight back from Geneva. So I come off of La Salette, I drive to Geneva. I'm staying on the couch in a friend's house in Geneva, waiting for my flight the next morning. And before I go to sleep, I say a prayer, which was a whine to God. I said, I can't believe you did this to me. I go halfway around the world to go skiing. It would have been the best skiing of my life because 3 feet of snow was falling a day, and you won't let me go skiing. You keep me stuck at La Salette. And with that, I go to sleep. And I wake into this dream, and I'm confronted with this man who was very grave and very serious, but at the same time, you could tell he was very loving. And the image I had of him was like that high school teacher that some people had, that I had, that was very serious and no nonsense, but the kids still knew he actually loved them more than the clappy, happy teachers, So I'm confronted with this man, and he drills me with his eyes, and he says, you can go skiing or you can work for the second coming. It's your choice. Which do you choose? Yeah. So anyway, I felt about 2 inches tall. And anyway, that's the end of the La Salette story, except that French woman I had met there calls me when I'm back in the United States, and she says, I think it would be a good idea if you checked out the Carthusians. Now, I don't know how many of you know who the Carthusians are. If you saw the movie Into Great Silence, that's the Carthusians. They're the strictest contemplative order in the church. They follow their 11th century rules still, pretty literally. They eat 1 meal a day. They live in solitary confinement. No socializing or talk between them except recreation, and even that's actually very restricted once a week. And so she tells me about it, and I say to myself, yeah, I want to talk to them because I still want to understand what was happening to me, which had been heavily mystical. And I figured if anyone has mystical experiences, it should be these guys. So I pick up the telephone, I call this Carthusian monastery, it's in France, and I say, could I visit and take a retreat there? They say, oh no, absolutely impossible, we're strictly cloistered, we don't receive anyone. But then he says, tell me something about yourself. So I start telling him something about myself, and I could hear his voice softening. So I say, should I send you a letter? And he says, oh yeah, good idea, send me a letter. So I write him a letter, and he immediately writes back, "You're welcome anytime." Of course, what I didn't know was their one exception to not receiving anybody is when they think it's a possible vocation. So I get on the next plane, I fly over there, I show up at this Carthusian monastery, and I'm joining them. I'm staying. I don't know. I'm staying there. The prior is coming to speak to me once a day to give me spiritual direction if I have any questions. I'm still Jewish. I'm still anti-Catholic. I think he's going to give me a sales pitch about why I should become Catholic. Every day he comes, after the meal, after lunch. Every day I'm braced for, okay, today is the day I'm going to get the sales pitch. He doesn't give it to me. He just, asks, do you have any questions, and so forth. So I can't stand the suspense anymore after about 3 or 4 days of this. So the next time he comes, I, just like hit him between the eyes and say, aren't you going to tell me why I should become Catholic? Very hostilely. And he says, oh no, not at all. All I ask of you is that you keep your eyes open and be honest with yourself about what you see. And this so impressed me. It was the opposite of what I expected from the Catholic Church. And it showed that he had faith that this was God at work, that the Holy Spirit was at work, and that what he had started, he wouldn't, stop midway. And so all I had to do was, keep my eyes open and be honest with myself. And this so impressed me. And then 2 other things impressed me. One was I was joining them for their offices every night. They only sleep about 3 hours at a time. They sleep from 8:30 to 11:30 at night. Then they get up and they chant. I'm not a very good Catholic. They chant vigils together. It's vigils, right? The night matins. I'm sorry. Of course, it's matins. They chant matins from 11:30 to 2:30 in the morning, and then they have a couple of hours of sleep before Lauds and Mass. And so I was joining them, and this is in these stalls in this 14th century monastery. There are all these old monks. They're actually chanting the Psalms out of parchment books that are 2 feet by 3 feet. They're the old, hand-written parchment books. And they're chanting the Psalms, and I'm looking around at all these men doing this every night through the night. And they're chanting. What are they chanting? They're chanting, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, should I ever forget you? Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth," And, "Oh, Zion, there's no place in the world as beautiful as you." And I'm looking around at these guys and saying to myself, these guys all want to be Jews. And so the other thing that happened there, and I'll end my witness testimony with this, was they weren't allowed to talk, right? So sometimes when they had a chance to cheat a little bit, they would take advantage of it. So I was doing my job there, which was scything the grass in the orchard one day, and this elderly monk shuffles out to me, and he says, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" And I said, "No." And he says, "Well then, if you don't mind my asking, you're not Catholic, are you? Because we noticed you weren't receiving communion." And I said, "No, that's right, I'm not Catholic." And he says, "Well then, if you don't mind my asking, what are you then?" And I stand up very proudly and I said, "I'm Jewish." And he says, "Oh, that's a relief. We were all afraid you were Protestant." So, you see how much I learned in this experience. The not being propagandized, but the faith in the Holy Spirit. The fact that the Catholic Church is the continuation of Judaism. The fact that the real Catholic spirit integrates and adopts the identification with the Jewish people and with the Old Testament, of course. The reason the monk said this was, of course, he saw Protestants as having had the fullness of the faith and turning away. So they were apostates, but the Jews were their elder brothers in the faith, so to speak. And the final thing I experienced there was I experienced the loving, gentle presence of the Blessed Virgin Mary was what made these monks joyful despite the rigor and severity of their lives. And I understood how the Catholic Church is like the institutional shell around the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the Virgin Mary is in some sense, and I don't want to be, burned at the stake for the heresy of this. It may not be, strictly speaking, correctly expressed, but the Blessed Virgin Mary is kind of the soul and heart of the Catholic Church, and where you have one, you have the other. So that's how I ended up being a Catholic, so thanks.